What if a small clay jar could quietly challenge our assumptions about technological progress? What if something unearthed from the ancient world looked disturbingly like a battery? Not a metaphorical battery, not a poetic comparison, a device with a ceramic container, a metal rod, and a copper cylinder, arranged in a way that, under the right conditions, can produce an electric current. The question is not whether it could. The question is why it existed at all. In the early 20th century, archaeologists working near Baghdad uncovered a modest clay vessel, roughly the size of a hand. Inside it was a copper cylinder, and within that cylinder, an iron rod. The components were carefully assembled and sealed with bitumen. At first glance, it did not seem revolutionary. It was cataloged as a curious artifact from the Parthian or early Sasanian period, likely dating between the last centuries BCE and the early centuries CE. But decades later, a simple observation would transform it from a museum piece into a global mystery. When similar replicas were constructed and filled with a mild acidic liquid, such as vinegar or grape juice, the arrangement produced a small electric voltage, around 1 volt. The principle is straightforward. Two different metals immersed in an electrolyte create a chemical reaction that releases electrons. This is the basic logic behind a galvanic cell, the foundation of modern batteries. The clay jar from a rock appeared to contain exactly the necessary elements: a ceramic container, a copper sheath, an iron rod, and a sealant to prevent leakage. The object became known as the Baghdad Battery, but naming something does not explain it. Could ancient craftsmen in Mesopotamia have understood electricity? Or are we projecting modern categories onto an ancient artifact whose true purpose lies elsewhere? There is no evidence of wires, no record of electrical theory, no surviving descriptions of controlled experiments. Ancient Mesopotamian texts are rich in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and engineering. They do not mention circuits or currents. And yet, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Knowledge does not always leave clear textual footprints. Some researchers have suggested the jars were used for electroplating, the deposition of a thin layer of metal onto another surface using electrical current. Electroplated objects have been identified in later historical periods, and experimental archaeology has demonstrated that small decorative plating is possible with low voltages. A series of such jars connected together could increase output. But here the evidence becomes thin. No definitive electroplating workshops from the Parthian period have been found. No wires or connectors were discovered alongside the jars, and the surviving examples are few. Other scholars propose more conservative interpretations. The jars may have been simple storage containers for scrolls or sacred objects. The metal rod might have served structural or ritual functions. Bitumen was commonly used as a sealant in the region. Copper and iron were familiar materials. In this view, the resemblance to a battery is coincidental, a modern observer's pattern recognition, rather than an ancient technological leap. There is also the possibility of medicinal or ritual use. Electric fish, such as the torpedo ray, were known in the ancient world for their shocking properties and sometimes applied therapeutically. It is conceivable that low-level electrical sensations were valued in certain contexts. But again, this remains speculation. No contemporary text connects these jars to healing practices. The Baghdad artifact sits in a space between demonstration and documentation. Laboratory tests confirm that the configuration can generate electricity. Archaeology has not confirmed that this was its intended function. The gap between capability and intention is where the debate resides. The story of the so-called Baghdad Battery reveals something deeper than the question of ancient electricity. It exposes our assumptions about linear progress. We imagine history as a staircase, each step higher than the last, each innovation building predictably on what came before. But the past is not always linear. Technologies emerge, disappear, reappear in different forms. Knowledge can be localized, fragmented, forgotten. Even if these jars were used as primitive galvanic cells, that would not mean ancient Mesopotamia had electrical grids or illuminated cities. It would suggest something subtler, an isolated understanding of a phenomenon, perhaps applied for a narrow purpose, without evolving into a broader scientific framework. Modern electricity required theoretical synthesis, from Volta's experiments in the 18th century to Faraday's work on electromagnetism and Maxwell's equations. The Baghdad artifact, by contrast, offers no sign of theoretical abstraction. It may represent empirical tinkering rather than systematic science. And yet, empirical experimentation is itself a form of intelligence. Ancient societies were not passive observers of nature. They engineered irrigation systems, calculated planetary motions, developed complex metallurgy, and built monumental architecture. The presence of a device capable of generating a small current should not be treated as implausible within that broader context. What is implausible is the leap from a single artifact to claims of lost civilizations powered by electricity. The evidence does not support that narrative. Responsible history resists spectacle. The artifact's power lies not in sensational claims, but in disciplined uncertainty. The Baghdad Battery forces us to confront a productive discomfort. It reminds us that archaeology often presents fragments without instruction manuals. Objects survive, explanations do not. When we encounter a device that resembles modern technology, we must ask two separate questions. What could it do, and what was it meant to do? Those are not the same question. The clay jar near Baghdad can produce a volt of electricity under experimental conditions. Whether ancient artisans intended that outcome remains unresolved. That unresolved space is not a weakness, it is the essence of historical inquiry. We do not honor the past by exaggerating it. We honor it by taking its ambiguity seriously. In the end, the Baghdad Battery may represent early experimentation with electrochemical reactions, or it may be an object whose purpose has nothing to do with electricity at all. What it certainly represents is a challenge to intellectual complacency. It asks us to recognize that history is not a simple story of ignorance replaced by enlightenment. It is a complex terrain of discoveries, misinterpretations, forgotten techniques, and rediscovered principles. A small clay jar, sealed with bitumen, carrying copper and iron within its walls, whether battery or container, reminds us of a humbling truth. The past is not silent because it lacked intelligence. It is silent because we are still learning how to listen.